I'm just very thankful that so far there has been a lot of open-minded reception to an instrument and to a sound that people might not be familiar with. And what is the bassoon? What can it sound like? What can it do? And I've generally been met with surprise and excitement about it, which is exactly what I was hoping would come out of something like this. So I would hope then that there's going to be revived interest in the instrument and its capabilities. That's sort of a concern that we as a bassoon community around the world have, is it can be pretty cost prohibitive for programs or students to purchase an instrument early on, and there are fewer and fewer students playing the bassoon each year. It's kind of the next one out of especially public school programs that just isn't being started. And so we're kind of artistically on the edge in a lot of ways of a bassoon shortage. So I'm hoping that just an interest in type of sound that you really can't get anywhere else, people will seek it out.
Cayla Bellamy, the WCF Symphony's guest concert artist. IPR's Symphonies of Iowa program today presents the WCF Symphony's concert called Honoring Our Own. The program concludes with the Fourth Symphony of Brahms. The first half closes with a concerto by Joan Tower, starring bassoonist Cayla Bellamy. When Dr. Bellamy appeared with the WCF Symphony in 2020, she was an assistant professor at UNI. She currently serves as assistant professor of bassoon at Colorado State University, where she teaches bassoon, chamber music, and directs the New Music Ensemble. She also performs in the Colorado Bach Ensemble and Pro Musica Colorado. Cayla stopped by the IPR studios and filled us in on everything we ever wanted to know about the bassoon.
What is a bassoon and how does it work? The bassoon is the lowest sounding woodwind instrument. It's one of the two sort of standard double reed instruments in the concert band symphonic setup as we know it today. So the other one is the oboe, which is the higher kind of pitched one. And pretty typically, if you go to orchestra concerts, you'll see us sitting behind each other. So the oboists sit in the front of the two woodwind rows next to the flutes, and the bassoons are right next to the clarinets immediately behind the oboes. And the double reed just means that it literally has two reeds. So if you've ever looked closely at a clarinet or a saxophone, and it has that black, either plastic or sort of hard rubber wooden mouthpiece with the piece of wood that's strapped to it, the bassoon and oboe both have two of those pieces of wood. It's made out of a piece of bamboo cane that's folded in half, and then the tip is clipped open, so you have two vibrating pieces.
And you make your own reeds.
I do, yes.
I mean, you don't make the reed itself, but you go out and chop down your own cane.
No, there's a very particular band of climate in the world that's sort of deemed appropriate that produces the most consistently vibrating cane. It has to be pretty warm year-round so that it grows consistently and we don't get kind of patches of different density that come with seasonal changes. And so I order my bassoon cane, and most of my students do also, from a company that gets theirs from either Argentina or sometimes you can get some from Australia or France. Have those kind of parallel bands. But we order just, it's about 6 inches long. It's a piece of bamboo about 1 inch in diameter, and everything from there on out, from that stick of bamboo down to the actual thing that we play on, is we make it all by hand.
Tell us about the bassoon, and it's quite an instrument.
The bassoon hasn't really been redesigned in a major way since about 1820, kind of the early 1800s. One of my favorite trivia pieces about the bassoon is that it's so ergonomically unfriendly. There are a lot of keys, a lot of keys on them. The left thumb, for example, mine has 9 different keys just for the left thumb. And it's not particularly friendly to play, and so they went through and some experts tried to redesign it about in the mid-1800s, and it went over so horribly that there is very little solo bassoon repertoire from that time because all of the renovations just weren't producing the kind of sound that people had come to associate with a double reed. I use buzzy in a good way, sort of that extra zing to the sound they lost as soon as we tried to redesign holes and create some things that were a little more acoustically appropriate. It was eventually discovered that one of the things that people like about the sound of the bassoon is the fact that it's structurally out of tune. And so the overtones don't quite line up. Something's just a little bit off, but that's part of its sound charm, I think. So it ends up having quite a lot of keys for relatively the same notes as anybody else.
and the bane of every bassoonist, I would guess. Tell us about the different pieces. One piece looks like it's extremely long, and your case, I know, isn't that long.
Yes, the instrument itself comes into sort of 4 pieces made out of wood, which are the main body of the instrument that looks like it's very long if you look at a bassoon from afar, especially someone that's standing and playing the way I was in the concert. The bottom of what we call the boot joint comes down to almost your knee. If you're seated in a chair, it'll come down about halfway to the floor, and then the bell, the top portion of it, will stick up probably 6 or 7 inches, depending on how tall you are, how big your head is, up from above your head. But each of those come into 4 components. So there's the top piece, that bottom boot joint, and then 2 middle pieces that are sort of strapped together so that the air itself goes from the reed through the only piece that's made out of metal, which we call the bocal, that curved kind of metal bit, goes down through there, through the farthest joint that's away from you to the boot joint. It actually goes around a metal curve, changes direction, and then comes back up out the bell.
What kind of wood is it made out of, and how do you hold it together?
Mine is actually made out of red maple, which is part of the naming of the concerto. But the most popular bassoon, I guess, materials are generally the maple family, either red or mountain maple. And each of the joints sort of fit together almost like a plug into a socket. So one is slightly more narrow than the opposing joint, and then the inside joint is either wrapped in cork or string to make sure that things won't get too slippery or too tight. And right about this time of year, when it starts thinking about getting warmer again, I usually have to go through and take mine are string wrapped. I usually have to go through and take a little bit of string off because everything swells when it gets warmer in the spring and summertime. But it's a pretty snug fit.
So what did it evolve from?
It's one of the oldest, so kind of the oldest wind instrument really that we know of. We're in that sort of sack butt being the brass version of kind of the predecessor of trombones and trumpets and things like that. And then the recorder, and the predecessor of the bassoon goes all the way back to kind of before, and the instrument that most people might recognize was the dulcian that Vivaldi wrote quite a bit for. It was really a sort of a single bore double reed instrument, so it was like a big recorder, but with a double reed instead of, blowing across an opening like you would for like a transverse flute or into a recorder. And that instrument itself actually came in a bunch of different sizes. That way they could play different ranges, and the smaller ones that played the higher notes eventually evolved into the oboe, and the larger ones evolved into the bassoon and then the contrabassoon, which is a 1 octave transposing lower than bassoon.
What enticed you to play the bassoon?
This is one of my favorite stories. I initially started out as a violinist. When I was in elementary school, I was in a Suzuki class when I started at a new school in 4th grade, and they had all started in kindergarten, so I was the 4th grader in a class of kindergartners, going very diligently through the Suzuki book and making probably terrible sounds. And we moved after my 5th grade year from Denver to the Atlanta area. And at that point, the school that I was enrolled in at middle school at the time didn't have an orchestra program. So I showed up to the first day of 6th grade with my violin, and they told me, we don't do that here. And we'll let you enroll in band class. You can practice violin in this practice room, which to me looked like a little prison. It was 11 years old. It was a little cinder block closet, I think. I said, or you can pick another instrument and join band. And so I very vividly remember picking my initial 6th grade instrument as the French horn, because they played all of the instrument demos, and I knew I wanted to play something pretty. I was very tired of making not pretty sounds on my violin. And so the demo, I don't know what it was, but they played something on the French horn. It sounded very beautiful to me, and I thought, oh, that's the instrument for me. And I grabbed my horn and sat down, and then the band director came back out with this funny-looking instrument. And he stood in front of the class. He said, we've got a really great group of people here, and we're going to be a great band, but we really can't be a great band unless we have every instrument. And we need someone to play the bassoon. And he didn't demo it, and I'm realizing now in retrospect, having worked with a number of aspiring and current music educators, that he might not have known how to play it. And he had the bassoon put together, though, and he just waited. I said, would someone please come try the bassoon? And I remember it felt forever. I thought, oh, I'll just give the poor guy a break. I'll go try the bassoon, and I'll come back to my horn. And I went up, and I was wearing glasses at the time, and I made a sound on it, and it sort of sounded like a dying cow or something. It was a really terrible sound. But the thing about the double reed instruments is they're very vibrant. They're physically very vibrant. And so it sort of tickles until you get desensitized to it. So I remember it kind of made my mouth tickle, and it made my glasses shake down my nose a little bit. But everybody laughed a little. I didn't think they were laughing at me, but it seemed like an interesting challenge. There were a lot of buttons, and I couldn't quite figure out where to put my fingers on them. And I've always been a kid who likes puzzles. And so I thought, this seems like a different kind of puzzle than only having 3 buttons. I'll pick the funny one that has lots of buttons, and I'm still trying to figure out how to use the buttons.
Did your parents say, a bassoon, when you walked in the door?
I think they must have been surprised. They were probably a little dismayed when I put it together and started playing, because I had just gotten past that point where it sounded terrible on the violin. I was playing tunes. I was into the second book. I could play things that sounded like music. And then I started just honking away and not really even putting my fingers in the right spot. I'm pushing buttons that weren't supposed to be pushed. And the thing about the way the bassoon is designed is it's so finicky. But there are so many different holes that have to be open in such a particular sequence to get a pure fundamental note to come out, that if you push the wrong one, it makes this sort of growling multiple note. We do it in extended techniques pretty frequently, called a multiphonic. So you play 5 or 6 notes at the same time, and it kind of sounds like Chewbacca. So I was making all these sounds. I mean, bless them. They didn't know what they signed up for.
Tell us about your bassoon and how you got your current instrument.
My current instrument, who I've affectionately named Antonio, I started playing that instrument in January 2012, and I spent a summer at the Aspen Music Festival, and I had been playing on sort of a student model instrument before, was in the market for something that I could potentially make my forever instrument, tested out a few different instruments, and I purchased this one. I'm the second owner, and this is an American model instrument that I stand by and absolutely love, and makes a really big sound. I wouldn't give it up now.
Well, it sounded marvelous at the Gallagher Blue.
Thank you.
Then after you got this bassoon and you started playing it, tell us just briefly about your career and some of the places that you have played and schools you have attended.
My undergraduate, I got a degree in music education from the University of Georgia, and after that I was actually a middle school band director. So I taught 6th through 8th grade band, and I was on the conducting faculty of the youth orchestra at Emory University. And I went back and got my master's also from University of Georgia, and then I did my doctorate at Indiana University. And then my position at UNI was the first position that I had after that. So I actually graduated with my doctorate in May of my first year teaching at UNI.
Tell us about this really fantastic concerto that Joan Tower wrote, and give us a little background on this piece.
It really is a wonderful concerto, and I sort of stumbled upon it by accident, really. I was looking for concertos that were written by American composers in particular, because I had started to set up sort of a season this year of works that just happened to all be rather contemporary within the last 6 or 7 years, all by American composers. So I performed a Libby Larsen work with the UNI Symphony that was already on the books. There's one for Bassoon and Wind Ensemble by James Stevenson, and I was looking for other kind of contemporary bassoon concertos, and this one popped up in a concert review, but I couldn't find a recording and I couldn't find the music for it. I knew that there was just a review of an opening premiere performance of Joan Tower's new bassoon concerto featuring Peter Kolke. And I had met Peter before. He was formerly on the executive board of our International Double Reed Society, and he'd performed this with the South Carolina Philharmonic at the time, so I just reached out to him. He teaches at Vanderbilt, and he sent me a recording of his premiere concert and some notes from when he had worked with Joan about the differences between her initial composition and what he ended up playing. And there's a second edition, and sort of helped me find that one. There's a version for bassoon and string quartet, then there's the full orchestral string orchestra version. I got a hold of those parts and started reading through some things, and reached out to Jason at the time about potentially doing something. We'd already been talking about doing something this season with the symphony, but hadn't landed on a piece yet. And this was one of the ones that I sent him. Basically, this would be a piece that I'd really like to play if it works with your season. And he wrote back and said, this actually works perfectly, because I'm already planning on doing one of her works in the spring semester. The piece itself is called Red Maple. It's named after the wood that a lot of bassoons are made out of. It also just so happens that a lot of the string instruments are made out of a different kind of maple. So it sort of plays off on the different kinds of sounds that instruments that are made out of the same material can make. And it's a single movement work. I hear it as 3 to 4 kind of major sections, each of which are bookended by cadenza. So it starts with a cadenza and has 2 or 3 major structural kind of pillars where the bassoon's completely unaccompanied before the strings come back in.
Other than this being a contemporary work for bassoon, what drew you to this work?
There's something about this particular sort of harmonic language in this work, I think it's very indicative of Joan Tower, if any of the listeners or if you're familiar with kind of how her style tends to be. It has a lot of these kind of harmonic progressions and modal scales, a lot of octatonic writing that we don't hear very frequently in sort of the classical Western canon. Most people have heard it in things like Stravinsky, where it sounds like it's dissonant, but it still sounds right. And she uses a lot of this particular language, but the bassoon concerto, it struck me as very different from a lot of things that I had heard by her before, which tend to be a lot more angular and kind of aggressive, very thickly textured things, which was in the first half of the program, I think, especially if they were there for the fanfare, hearing the types of sounds that are still very rhythmically driven, but a lot more variety in the colors. So to have this kind of monochromatic variations on a theme of color while having this really interesting harmonic language, I was very intrigued by it, especially in light of the 4 concert season that I had set up. This was a really nice way for the season to progress for just me as an artist with these 4 works.
It was interesting. You said something about how she hadn't written a bassoon concerto because she thought no one would want her to.
I heard that from a friend, and I'm not sure how much of this was just passing through, like you play operator. It's a story passed from one person to the next, but I kind of like the story, so I'm almost okay with passing it on, even if it's not entirely accurate. The version that I heard was that she has written a number of works for other woodwind instruments. So there are quite a few of the chamber works. She knows have very prominent flute parts, and there's sort of some flute, not quartet, but multiple flute works. And there's quite a bit of solo clarinet music and clarinet concerto. And there's almost no other real use of the bassoon. There's a bassoon part in the fanfare, but it's not really featured. It's sort of treated as it typically is in an orchestral setting. We don't often get featured as bassoonist unless there's something dying or something that's a joke happening in the background. So the version of the story that I heard was that somebody had asked her once why she didn't write for the bassoon. She said, well, I didn't think any bassoonist would want to play it. And I'm guessing that's because it's quite difficult. And there, as we had previously discussed, there are a lot of keys and a lot of things that go into playing the bassoon. So to play something very flashy is a little more finger challenging than on some other instruments.
You mentioned that this has 4 parts and it has a cadenza opening and closing, which is kind of unusual in itself. Mm-hmm. So tell us about the other middle parts.
What I kind of hear is different types of conversation. The work itself is the solo bassoon either in an amicable pairing with the strings or in something that I hear is a little more aggressive. So the opening is a very sort of lamenting developing of the initial motives of the piece. There are some kind of recurring intervals that are first presented in a very slow fashion in the opening cadenza that are then elaborated upon by the string orchestra. Sometimes it's in parallel, so you'll hear the same 3 notes, the sort of descending minor second to minor third motive that comes up pretty frequently. Sometimes they're presented in a cluster, and sometimes it's presented horizontally in a series. So you hear each note is a separate entity that winds through a series of very fast triplets or something. So the opening passage sounds very smooth and kind of, like I said before, lamenting, and then it gets a little more riled up, leading into the second cadenza that has some wider intervals, but still in a lyrical fashion. So it's quite a lot of large slurs, just something that seems to be an element of these new American bassoon concertos that I'm having to practice a lot, is how do I do very wide slurs without being able to use sort of my tongue to help kickstart the reed into the right register. And then those wide intervals become even less lyrical and become much more aggressive into the end of the work, which really highlights kind of the difference between large leaps that are presented almost percussively, really slamming into those extremely high and extremely low notes in very quick succession, and going back to that initial motive of the minor second, but now it's chained upon itself. So you get these very fast chromatic passages that are sort of woven in between all of these big leaps. And that initial 3-note motive comes back at the end with the orchestra and the bassoon in competition with one another.
Joan Tower was considered at the beginning of her career in the 60s as a pioneer woman. Do you consider yourself a pioneer woman of the bassoon?
I don't think I necessarily call myself a pioneer. I am a person that likes to be on the front edge of something. I've always kind of tended toward building over maintaining, just as a general principle. So this idea of selecting pieces that are new, and even if it's not composers that are new, what's the next thing that the instrument can do? And sometimes that is technically, and sometimes it is, as with this piece in particular, it is in terms of the sound. The bassoon is not an instrument that's often celebrated for its variety in sound. I think composers use the bassoon pretty frequently in different capacities. They utilize different sounds, but in very different settings. But it's becoming much more of a push for us as bassoonists and as performers to put them side by side, to immediately be able to shift from something that's kind of a wispy, mysterious quality into something that's more aggressive, and not just be sort of like the vanilla backseat player. And I think in that way, the field itself is becoming a lot more pioneering. And by being public and in the middle of it, an association, but I don't know if I am causing any of it. I'm glad to help promote it.